Okay, well, thank you very much. My name's Andy Jordan. I'm very much at the University of East Anglia, where I work in the Tyndall Centre. Thanks for your invitation, particularly to the organisers and particularly to Angelos. I think it's a really important conference on a very important topic, and it's very timely as well. So really what I want to talk about is internal climate policy within the EU. Now, it's important, as we heard from Rudy earlier this morning, what the EU does internally affects its ability to be a shaper at the international level. It's also terribly important for what goes on at the national level as well through processes of Europeanisation. But I think the EU also provides a really nice kind of example as well about governing in a very sort of polycentric, to use a term that Elinor Ostrom began to develop in her later years, of governing in a very polycentric setting. And there are possibly broader lessons that we can draw from the EU's experience and apply to other polycentric settings. I'm particularly interested in my very broad brush overview of climate policy and some of the paradoxes that emerge when the EU tries to govern in this very polycentric setting. One of the paradoxes that Rudy talked about earlier this morning was this paradox of leadership, or of aspiring to lead in a setting that actually is being deliberately created to be leaderless. And that's obviously one paradox. But I think there are others. And what I want to focus on is how these paradoxes have constrained the EU's ability to lead, and/or might affect it going forward towards these very ambitious targets which you just referred to of achieving virtual decarbonisation by 2050. And let's not be under any illusion, that's going to be a big, big challenge. So I'm going to draw upon work that we've done in two EU-funded projects, ADAM, which was funded under FP6, and also Responses, which is still taking place, which is funded under FP7. Now, the literature on the EU in its early years, I'm thinking about the late 80s and early 90s, began to try and understand the EU in very broad terms. But as the EU developed and the EU climate policy developed, there was a shift, I think, to focus on much more specific things like the emergence of ETS, for example. But I think in recent years there's been a kind of turn back and an attempt to sort of stand back and think about the whole. And one of the first, and I think very influential attempts, was one made by Miranda Schroers and Yves Tiberghien in an article in Global Environmental Politics, which was published in 2007. And she made the very general argument that the EU had been able to achieve in the climate area lots of innovative new policies through a process which she termed multi-level reinforcement. And really what I want to do in my 30 to 40 minutes is try and think about whether that's a very general argument that holds for different time periods and in particular might hold for the future of the EU, or really whether it was a very specific argument about a very specific time period in the EU's climate policy development. I'm going to do that by extending the time frame a little bit more beyond that rather narrow time frame that Miranda took. And also, and building on the previous presentation, think about not just mitigation, which the EU's done a lot on, but increasingly also adaptation. By doing that and by broadening the focus a little bit, I want to argue that there are at least 5 paradoxes. There's not just one, but there's 5 of them. And I'm going to unpack those in a little bit of detail and think about their possibly constraining or enabling effects on the EU. And then I want to be a little bit provocative at the end as well. I want to begin to explore the future of climate policy, not sort of the immediate future, you know, the prospects for the ETS or, you know, the controversies around biofuels or aviation, but, you know, 20 or 30 years ahead and think about where the EU's going, in particular about the sufficiency of the 2-degree target, but also, and this is a very topical issue, how it's going to do it, how it's going to govern in a way that's inclusive and legitimate and in a way that delivers a really, really radical change. So the history, I think, the historical time period that Miranda and Eve looked at was one which Rudy's already summarised. I won't go through it in detail, but it essentially covered the period from the sort of mid-1990s to the late 2000s. And it really was a period where the EU seemed to get its act together. It managed to distribute burdens or efforts, as we now like, the EU now likes to talk to them about, and develop lots of new and relatively innovative policies. And on the basis of that, Miranda talked about a sustained pattern of policy innovation, although she didn't actually, interestingly, define policy innovation. Anyway, and she talked about these innovative policies emerging out of a process of multi-level reinforcement. So actors at different levels supporting one another in a way that sort of gradually led to more ambitious policies being adopted over time. And it did so in a way which overcame many of the sort of obstacles which I think that Rudy talked about this morning: weak competence in certain areas, conflict between particular member states, and a whole myriad of different veto points and veto actors at different levels. Now, out of that, she developed this idea of the EU engaging with a particular paradox, the idea that it leads but somehow is leaderless, which is sort of slightly counterintuitive. Now, if you look at the fuller history of EU climate policy, and I'm thinking about the period before the mid-1990s, then there was a very long period of development when there were lots of conflicts between different member states, a real lack of a joint kind of common enterprise and a common vision. And it took a long time for EU climate policy to develop. And if we go to the period since about 2007, which is kind of when Miranda's kind of analysis ended, there's been also, again, a return to a more conflictual relationship between different actors. I mean, we can see this in lots of different sub-areas of climate policy, but in particular in relation to the failure to agree a more stringent reduction target beyond, not of 20% reduction, but of 30% reduction. So if we now try and take stock now, having looked at the longer time frame and also thought about the way in which policies developed over time, I think we can argue, well, I would like to argue, that policy has developed much more slowly than I think Miranda and Eves initially argued. It's developed in a more sort of variegated and differentiated fashion as well. I mean, just to give one example, if you look at the kind of policy instruments that the EU has developed and employed to deal with its climate or to implement its climate targets and objectives, they're very heavily reliant on the sort of the hard stick of regulation. Market-based instruments, informational instruments and voluntary instruments have either not been heavily used, or in the case of voluntary instruments have been used but have found to not be very successful and have been replaced by regulation. So if we think about the overall toolbox that the EU relies upon, it's a relatively it doesn't employ the full range of different tools. It's also more variegated, as I've explained. It's also much stronger in relation to mitigation than it has been in relation to adaptation. And you can see that on this very simple diagram here. If you think about the different ways in which the EU makes decisions, I mean, on the left-hand side we have the classic sort of community method, where the Commission works hand in hand with the member states to co-produce policy. And on the other hand, we think about the classic sort of intergovernmental method, which corresponds very much more to the world which international relations scholars generally use. Energy policy in the EU has really moved from a very intergovernmental way of acting much more towards a regulatory mode. Similarly with mitigation, we see much more co-production of policy in this sort of multi-level, multi-actor way. But adaptation still stays very much on the right side. I mean, arguably with the new strategy, it might begin to move a little bit more in this direction. But if you think about the overall mix of instruments and the overall focus and goals of policy, it's more differentiated. So on that basis, I think there's not just one, but I think possibly at least 5 different paradoxical features, which I think are worth exploring in a little bit of detail. Of course, we have the first one, that it aspires to lead, and to a large extent can be said to have led, but it is itself relatively leaderless. That's the first one. The second one is that it almost craves external actorness. It tries to act externally as a single coherent body, but it struggles to do that. And those sort of struggles have been particularly well exemplified in conferences like at Copenhagen, when there was almost like a conference within a conference. And I'll say a little bit more about how the EU's tried to overcome that paradox in a second. I think the EU is very much a harmonising organisation. It tries to harmonise across the different member states, but it also tries to harmonise in the sense of, agreeing a single set of policies and reduction targets that then it can take to the international level and thereby exert leadership. But look in a little bit more detail though, and you see that actually within that there's a lot of complicated burden sharing going on some issues, but not on all issues. And that's slightly sort of paradoxical. Its targets are relatively ambitious. Now, whether they've been implemented or not is another question, but its targets are pretty ambitious, but still it's very heavily reliant on a rather sort of narrow sort of toolbox. Regulation it keeps coming back to and keeps employing. And then finally, it's tried to adopt a very ambitious approach in its policies, but it still struggles with implementation. I mean, environmental policy is that's always been the Achilles of environmental policy implementation. But still, in the climate policy, it's still not clear whether all the policies and instruments that have been adopted really will take the EU in the direction that it wants to. I mean, as we heard earlier this morning in the discussion, it's been it's rather fortuitously been able to live off the sort of gratis emission reductions that have been made by economic or have arisen because of economic restructuring. So what I want to do now is just go through these paradoxes in a little bit more detail and actually show how they are interdependent, and interdependent in a way which I think will shape the ability of the EU to keep moving forward in this kind of self-reinforcing sort of way. So I think what Miranda told us was and very clearly showed was that actually you can engage in policy innovation in a policy system which is riddled with veto points and potential veto players. And the way that it's managed to do that, I think, is to ensure that no one level of government or one actor is completely captured by short-term changes in the issue attention cycle. So as long as there's at least one group of actors that's able to lead, then it can, push the rest in a more sort of ambitious direction. Now that's very much kind of fits the sort of literature that has emerged about governing in different multi-level contexts. I mean, Weaver and Rockman's classic study about institutions confirms that. But I think what's really interesting about the EU, though, is that although it's been able to innovate because of the different levels of governance and the opportunities that provides, I think it's still unclear whether it has the capabilities, as many multi-level systems show, to engage in conscious implementation. I mean, I think what Weaver and Rockman very successfully did show is there's a bit of a trade-off. If you've got a very clear point of leadership, then it might take a long time to actually get innovation going, but once you've actually agreed on something, implementation can be a lot easier. What about the second paradox? Well, the second paradox relates to this relationship between external actorness and internal division. And I think, this quote from Connie Hedegaard, I think really clearly brought that out in the way that she talked about, how within the final sort of stages of the end game at Copenhagen, the EU was almost unable to come up with a common position because it was spending so much time negotiating with itself. Now, I think the EU has begun to address this paradox. It has gradually upgraded its internal coordinating mechanisms, and Rudy talked about them this morning. But still, there remains the difficulty, and I think this has been really clearly revealed in the relation to the discussion about 30% reduction, about how it can come up with a coherent, target that it can then take up to the EU, to the international level, and thereby exert leadership. So I think there's been a lot of incremental sort of patching going on to try and achieve greater internal coherence, but I would argue, I think there needs to be more of that before the EU can really exert international leadership. Now, when it comes to policy harmonisation, the EU has really engaged in some really complicated internal burden sharing. I think, Rudy, you showed this already. I've taken it from a recent EEA report. And you can see here how the EU actually has engaged in several rounds of internal burden sharing and come up with a complicated division like that. But it's not yet managed to engage in burden sharing on each and every single issue. I mean, it's arguably done it in relation to a 20% reduction on the mitigation side, but it's certainly not done it in terms of a 30% reduction target. It's certainly not done it really, or even begun to do it, in relation to adaptation, about how finance might be moved between different parts of the EU to help, especially vulnerable member states. And it's not also, barely even started to do it in relation to how the EU might distribute the burden of the financial burden which might arise if the EU was really to follow up on its financial commitments to the developing countries post Copenhagen. And put it very bluntly, I mean, who's actually going to pay the lion's share of that extra money? Is it going to come from Germany, as this sort of arrangement might suggest, or might some of these other member states who currently at the moment don't have, nearly such significant reduction targets, be expected to pay more? I think that's a really thorny political problem that the EU has, I think, barely even started to confront. So we have the ambitious targets and the very limited toolbox, or at least the toolbox that's not really been as heavily and as fully employed as it might have done. I think in terms of the ambition level of the EU, I think, we've seen already with the emissions trading system, the thing that took a long time to develop, and which is very much the central kind of linchpin of the EU system. I mean, it's struggled really to make headway. Diagrams or figures like this, which show that the carbon price kind of just gradually tailing off, is it must keep people awake at night in Brussels. But I think it reveals that the EU's ability to implement its objectives and its promises are by no means secure. I think in the past, again, as Rudy said, I think what the EU's been able to do is calibrate its promises to kind of stay just the right side of the long-term reduction in emissions. I mean, sometimes it kind of almost slightly got it wrong. For example, the point that John made about the period before Kyoto, when it kind of almost promised more than it seemed able to deliver on at the time. But generally speaking, it's kind of kept its emission reductions targets in sync with the trend in emissions. Now, of course, the big question is, if it moved to 30% reduction, would it be able to do that? The latest predictions are that it would require more policies or maybe more stringent policies than it currently has. But if we extend the time period to here, to 2050, when where a much more significant reduction will be required, I think that's really, really going to put the EU's implementing instruments under unprecedented pressure, far greater pressure than they've endured at the moment. In fact, it is by no means clear as actually what the different reduction efforts that the different instruments have actually made. I mean, there isn't really at the moment the information provided by the EEA on a sort of instrument by instrument basis. So I think a lot is really being expected of the instruments, which at the moment are I think, are far from proven. Okay, so what about moving forwards? I think there are two kind of really challenging questions, and I'm going here beyond the kind of day-to-day stuff, the reform of the ETS system, the conflict about biofuels, and whether or not the EU extends the ETS to foreign countries outside the EU. I think there are two kind of almost like existential questions which I think are sort of hanging in the air, and I think it would be good to kind of raise now and debate in a little bit of detail. I think the first one relates to what is the overall goal of EU policy. Now, generally, as we've just heard, it was the assumption was that it was a 2 degree to remain within 2 degrees, and that was really the sort of meta goal of policy. But as the world, as it becomes more and more obvious that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to stay within 2 degrees, then what happens? The second one is how is the EU actually going to transition the rest of Europe in a direction towards deep carbonisation in a way that's not just politically sustainable, but actually democratically and legitimately sustainable as well, particularly in a period not just of austerity, but possibly long-term austerity. Now, if we think about the kind of worlds in which, the different kind of policy worlds in which the EU might find itself going forwards, I think it might be useful just to engage in a little bit of scenario analysis. And I've taken this from the book that we produced out of the Adam project, where, with the help of Frans Berkhout at the University of, in the Free University of Amsterdam, we began to think about, in very broad terms, how policy might move forward. And in scenario terms, we can think about a world that's highly coordinated, or we could think about a world that's highly or much more autonomous, coordinated through international agreements, for example, like Kyoto, or much more autonomous. Or we could also think about the goals of policy as well. Is it going to be a world in which mitigation is going to be the primary emphasis, and that through engaging in mitigation we can avoid the worst effects and therefore don't need to engage in so much adaptation? Or in fact, is mitigation going to be not so much of a priority, and the emphasis is going to be on adapting to effects as and when they emerge? And on the basis of those different axes, we came up with 4 different kind of worlds. And I'm not going to go through these in a huge amount of detail. I think 2 are worth kind of picking out. I think this one here, a highly coordinated world, very strong reliance on mitigation. At the time we were playing with different names. We actually referred to this as Dimas world. I mean, Dimas at the time, Stavros Dimas was the Environment Commissioner. But I think we could probably call it Hennegaard world as well. It's a world in which EU climate policy has emerged and to a large extent has thrived. It's a world in which the EU is kind of protected and set within a broader framework of international law. It gives the EU the confidence to keep developing more ambitious policies, whilst at the same time ensuring that there isn't a sort of leakage of carbon to other parts of the world. The other world, of course, which at the time we referred to as Bush world, but you could also refer to it as Romney world, I think, as well, is a totally different world. And it's a world in which you've got much more autonomy and a much stronger emphasis on on adaptation. Now, I would argue that what's happened internationally is that policies move from this bottom right-hand corner much more towards the top left-hand corner. And I think that the direction of travel, I think, was confirmed by the outcome of the Copenhagen conference. So I think for EU, the challenge is to move its policy from this sort of quadrant and ensure that it kind of begins to exist and can thrive in a much different sort of world. I think initially, the EU was very confident that it could do this. I mean, if you remember the words that Barroso used, where he turned around this very positive sort of argument that had originally been used by Obama in his first election win. Yes, you can. Yes, you can do what we are doing. I think there's very great confidence that 2 degrees and staying within 2 degrees would deliver lots of good things for the EU, energy security and green growth. I think what we're now realizing, though, is that actually it's going to, emissions are continuing to rise. I mean, the 2009 reduction was a bit of a blip, but globally emissions are back on their historical trajectory. So 2 degrees seems less likely than it was, even in the late 2000s. And even if we were to stay within 2 degrees, I mean, the work that's coming out of the IPCC, as some of you will have seen this, the so-called burning embers diagram, shows, I think, that the level of impacts that are likely to be found at 2 degrees are much greater than they were originally expected when the third assessment report was produced in 2001. Generally, red on the diagram shows high risk, yellow shows lower risk. So moving from 2001 to, I think, 2009 when this was done, much more significant risks to different ecosystems in different parts of the world than there were. So the Earth system is more vulnerable, I think, which was the point you were making. So where does this leave the 2 degree target? Well, I think the EU really has a problem here, because it could, on the one hand, cling to the 2 degree target but that seems risky, I think, because it's becoming more and more obvious it's going to be difficult to stay within the 2 degree target. And the danger, I think, is that by sticking to the 2 degree target, the EU underplays the big, adaptation challenge, which is, or as the scientists are telling us, down the road. Or it could be perhaps more politically realistic and say, well, actually 2 degrees is going to be very difficult to achieve. Let's go for something else, like 3 or even 4 degrees. I think most people think the debate about 1.5 degrees is really just, I think, a fantasy. But whether we think even about 3 or 4 degrees. Now this is politically very disruptive, I think, for the EU. It could, for example, begin to open up claims for damages within the EU, so the poorer countries who have been affected by or are likely to be affected by the impacts of climate change, making calls on the richer countries for help with adaptation finance and support. And of course it could also quite radically undermine the whole move towards decarbonisation. Or we could adopt what some of the scientists are now suggesting we adopt, which is a kind of a hedging strategy where we mitigate for 2 and adapt for 4. But that's by no means, it's easy to make that argument in scientific terms, but in governance terms, it's actually aiming for 2 different things at the same time could be, I think, rather a difficult, tricky, and a very tricky thing to do, and possibly end up with either not enough mitigation and almost too much adaptation. And then, of course, this is the second kind of more existential question, which is, how is the EU actually going to make this big and very radical shift towards decarbonisation? I think I mean, let's be completely honest about this. I mean, the EU really over the last few years has gone through a near-death experience. I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that. Things that were literally off the agenda, the breakdown of the whole EU and the collapse of the Eurozone, have suddenly been pushed onto the political agenda in a way that I don't think people could possibly have thought about even 4 or 5 years ago. So where does this leave EU climate policy? Well, of course, in a slightly perverse way, it has actually helped reduce emissions, but I mean that's been a very short-term effect. I think there are possibly two issues or things that, or possibly two dimensions which I think could really affect climate policy. I think one is, of course, the possible shift towards an inner and an outer core within the EU. I mean, this is now a much more of a realistic possibility than even people at the height of the crisis were talking about. How is that going to affect climate policy? How is it likely to affect the ability of the EU to come up with common, coordinated policies and measures? The fact that you've got, deep agreement on certain issues and less agreement and less collaboration on others. Of course, there might be opportunities as well that could be secured as well there. For example, the fact that the EU is moving much more towards fiscal coordination could actually, open up the possibility for the EU to engage in more, or to use other tools like taxation, for example. But the other dimension, I think, of course, is the democratic dimension as well. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind, because no political system, however complex and however sophisticated it is not going to endure unless it's democratic and legitimate in the eyes of its various citizens. And I think the EU, thus far with its climate policies, has engaged in a lot of very technocratic sort of governance, hasn't it? A lot of the critical burden sharing agreements and the design of the ETS were really sort of, cooked up and developed and agreed in fairly sort of technocratic fora. Now, whether that's going to be a sustainable, I'm talking about politically sustainable way of making policy as we move towards 2050 and achieve and seek to achieve much more significant reduction targets, I think is really something that we as analysts of the EU should really begin to seriously think about. So let me try and wrap all that up. I think in terms of the argument about multi-level reinforcement, I think if you, to use a piece of political science terminology, if you begin to unpack the dependent variable and you think about policy not just in terms of big policy goals, but in terms of policy instruments and policy strategies and different ways of coordinating between different actors, I think looking across, and also across a much broader sweep of time, I think casts doubt on the idea that what we're seeing in the EU is a long-term process of constant and highly secured multi-level reinforcement. I think that term referred to a particular period of time in the EU's climate policy development, and it particularly applied to mitigation, which I think fitted very much with the EU's core sort of goals of market liberalisation. I think it's anybody's guess whether adaptation is likely to experience this process of multi-level reinforcement. At the moment, adaptation policymaking is developing a lot more slowly and a lot more incrementally, and I think the opportunities for finding interesting and good synergies between mitigation and adaptation really is something that the EU, I think, is struggling with. There are many more paradoxes than I think Miranda talked about in her article. I think there are at least 5. There might even be more. It'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about that. I think so far, I think the EU has skillfully sort of managed to sort of tweak some of these paradoxes to keep mitigation sort of going and sort of on track. Now, whether it can continue to do that in a way that not only keeps mitigation going and also builds adaptation, but finds synergies between the two, again, as I've said, is anybody's, I think, guess. And it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about that. I think there are many more significant challenges ahead for the EU. I mean, I think really the EU's done the easy stuff now. I mean, it might at the time have felt quite difficult, but I think he's done the easy stuff, which of course means that it is going to provide lots of work for people working in Brussels and in Strasbourg. But I think it also means that there's a lot of opportunities for those of us in the room who study the EU and seek to draw lessons from the EU, because it really is a very dynamic and very active area of policy making. And I think there are huge possibilities for people in particular to build alliances with natural scientists and people who study, energy systems, and to try and find, good sort of strong interdisciplinary connections. Because I think really, if we don't get those connections, I think as a society, we're really going to struggle to deal with this this carbon problem that we deal with. Okay, thanks for listening.